Good evening, everyone, and welcome to Black Literature, Black History. This is Jason Williams. Tonight we're going to be discussing a book called The Blacker the Berry, a novel of Negro life written by Wallace Thurman in 1929. Now, 1929 marks a period in U.S. history when the stock market crashed and took us into a period known as the Great Depression. However, that is not the central theme of this book, but at the beginning of the book, it provides a background of a migration of blacks from the South into the North and into the West. Now, this book, The Blacker the Berry, the central theme is based on intraracial color prejudice, which we call colorism, and a novel of Negro life. For this book, follows the life of a dark-skinned female from childhood into womanhood, from Boise, Idaho to California into Harlem, and what she experiences as far as colorism. And through her experience and through her journey, we get to see issues in the black community that they struggled with back then that we still continue to struggle with today in 2018. Now, what I like about this short novel or novella, because it's a little over 100 pages, is that instead of jumping into the East Coast and into Harlem or into France, which many of the novels during the 1920s or the Harlem Renaissance do, Wallace Thurman takes us from the South, where blacks came up from the South, and their reasons for moving out west into Boise, Idaho. Now, Emmylou is a very dark-skinned woman, and this novel opens up with her feeling her color during graduation. She grew up in a black family, however, she was surrounded by whites, so her color was really a central thought of hers during graduation. However, another thing I like about this book is that other than that beginning of graduation, this is a book about black people and their struggles with colorism. Is not a book about white people and black people and racism experienced there. So once after graduation, it jumps into Emmylou's background. Now, Emmylou is a very dark-skinned girl, and she was born from a dark-skinned father and a fair-skinned mother. And her mother was fair-skinned, her grandmother was fair-skinned, and the majority of her family were fair-skinned, and they never understood why Emmylou's mother decided to have a child with this dark-skinned black man named Jim Morgan. Now, in this discussion, they have the grown-ups having background talks behind Emmylou's back about color. And a lot of adults don't recognize this, but many times when they're having these discussions about a child or about their children, many times their children are in the vicinity where they can hear these discussions, and at the time that they hear the discussion, they don't understand what is being discussed, but they remember the words, and when they grow up, they start putting these words and ideas together, and they realize what their parents and what the grown-ups were talking about. So as Emmylou grows up in Boise, Idaho, she remembers and she recalls her parents talking about that it's not so bad for a man to be dark-skinned, but it's unacceptable for a woman to be dark-skinned. And Emmylou's mother, Jane, fell in love with Jim Morgan, a black man, and she felt that her light-skinned genes would be enough for her and him to have a brown baby or even a fair-skinned baby. But once Emmylou came out dark-skinned, that was the downfall of that relationship. It was too much for the light-skinned family to accept, and Jim Morgan, who doesn't actually really even appear in this novel, he's no more than a story, is out of the picture. So we don't even really get to see who Jim Morgan is and what type of person he was. But we get Jane growing up in a very color-struck family. So much that her family moved out to Boise, Idaho, and then they talk about the formation of what is known as the Blue Vein Society that they were trying to create out there. Now, the Blue Vein Society, that word comes from a society in which you can become a part of the society if you're light enough to see the blue veins in your wrist. So someone of my complexion would be welcome into the Blue Vein Society. But Emmylou, being dark-skinned, would not be accepted into this society. And this society was built and maintained by her grandmother. So her mother was part of this society, her grandmother was a part of this society, and whenever they spoke of Emmylou's father, they always put the word black somewhere around his name, the black skin, the negative connotation. So as Emmylou grows up, every time she hears black skin, there's negative connotations, and she realizes that she's black. So she gets older, she graduates high school, and then they send her off to college to Los Angeles. Now, when she goes to Los Angeles, she has hope of meeting what she always calls the right sort of people. Now, this is a very interesting glimpse into Emmylou's way of thinking, because when she goes to Los Angeles, she believes that people there will be more open-minded, and what she wants to fit in with the educated blacks there. So when she arrives there, the first person that she comes into contact is a girl from the South who speaks in Afro-American vernacular or Ebonics, and she doesn't like this woman or this other girl, this other student, because she talks like uneducated black people, or she talks in Afro-American vernacular. She made it into the college because her father had a lot of money and was able to send her there. But what we notice is that even though Emmylou grew up with all of this colorism and prejudice against her, she is still formed by the ideas of her fair-skinned family. So all the prejudices and everything that they have against dark-skinned blacks and uneducated blacks, or not the right sort, Emmylou feels that racism against her. However, she expresses that with her reactions to other blacks that she encounters, and we get the first glimpses of that during her time in college. So she rejects this black girl who accepts her, because the black girl that she first met, she just wanted to be around another black person. So Emmylou spends all kind of time trying to avoid her, and eventually avoids her. She meets other blacks that are of higher society, lighter skin for the most part, except for one girl. And I don't remember all of their names because there's a lot of characters in this novel. But what the discussion that takes place while she is in college is that light-skinned blacks are accepted in the sororities, invited to the parties, and click up. Now, within these lighter-skinned blacks, and the right sort of which Emmylou wants to be a part of what Emmylou admires, however, is not accepted by. There is one dark-skinned girl who is a part of that clique. But during the discussions that Emmylou has with herself, because in novels, which you can't get in any other genre of art, is discussions that a person has with themselves in their mind. And Emmylou tells us that if a black female is accepted into the clique, she either has a lot of money to offer, or she is extremely beautiful, or she's a very high status. And that's how dark-skinned black women are accepted into the right sort of people. However, Emmylou was an ordinary dark-skinned black girl. So she was not accepted even by the dark-skinned black girl who was in the clique of the right sort. So it's very interesting that Emmylou, even though she feels the sting of racism against her because of her color, she also has that resentment against darker skinned blacks, which is, we get a glimpse of that when she's in Los Angeles. So she doesn't like her experience in Los Angeles in college. She goes back to Boise, Idaho. And in Boise, Idaho, she falls in love with a guy who's just passing through, and she gets together with him. She becomes a woman. They talk about her making love with this guy, and then she's naive. It's very artistic how Wallace Thurman shows her naivety when she's just making a life of them living happily ever after, but he's just passing through for a period of time, and then he moves on to work on a railroad. And then she kind of grows up and realizes, well, what I think about life and my plans for life may not be what another person is thinking. So she grows up pretty quick, and then she decides to go to Harlem. Now in Harlem, we really get to see Emmylou's prejudice. In Harlem, she doesn't want to have anything to do with dark-skinned blacks. And through Emmylou, she starts to take bleaching agents. She takes these wafers that are supposed to make her lighter skinned because she goes out for jobs as a stenographer. She was sent out to a job. The people didn't want her, and it was very evident that they didn't want her because she was dark-skinned. But what Wallace Thurman demonstrates with her taking these bleaching agents, these bleaching creams, and these wafers that are supposed to make her lighter, is they make her sort of a purplish color. They make her look really foolish, and they make her very ugly. And I think what he's displaying there is what we also see today when not just dark-skinned black girls, but when women don't find themselves attractive and they start adding all of these agents and all of these makeups and weaves and things that you can clearly see, like a lot of times with the weaves and with the braids, you can clearly see that it's damaging to their skin. And a lot of this makeup and stuff is damaging to the skin, and it makes them look worse than what their natural color and natural hairstyle is. And not just with the women, but with the men also. And Malcolm X, he was born in 1925, So sometime around this period when he was a criminal, and he talked about the lie that he would put in his hair to straighten his hair, because men used to straighten their hair with lye. He used to talk about it burning his scalp. You know, and he ended up putting his head in the toilet. And that wasn't just in the movie, that was also in the novel, that the autobiography of Malcolm X, which I recommend that everyone read. Because he talks about self-hatred and this stuff about changing your skin color, changing your hair texture, all of this stuff to make yourself lighter or resemble white people is self-hatred, which is a discussion that many people try to avoid having today, but it is. And it damages yourself, which is discussed in this book. Now, throughout this novel, Emmylou is approached by dark-skinned men, and she rejects them. And then she meets a man named Alva, who is half Filipino and half black, which is very interesting because if you look in the pages that I've done before, the videos that I've done before, Filipinos continuously pop up. They're showing up. They're showing up in the autobiographies. They're showing up in the articles, the Back to Africa articles. They're popping up. I did a page on David Fagan, when blacks went to the Philippines, which gives a good reason of why blacks and Filipinos have this kinship, with the fact that David Fagan defected from the U.S. Army and lived out the rest of his life in the Philippines with the black community in the Philippines. But there's a whole chapter dedicated to a character named Alva. He's half black, half Filipino, fair-skinned. Now, Wallace Thurman uses Alva to demonstrate colorism, again, because Emmylou is dark-skinned and she really appreciates the attention that she gets from Alva. However, Alva's just a straight player. He doesn't really have affection for Emmylou, but he uses her, and then he takes her to a meeting or a party, a rent party, with his friends. Now, this was very apparent that Wallace Thurman just wanted to throw the niggerati, his crew, into this book, and I will read you a few paragraphs in that section so you can see what he's talking about. Part 4 is actually where it starts, the rent party, and I will start when it starts to talk about the niggerati. These were his friends, and so was Braxton. But Alva said he was peculiar. There was no danger. Alva had invited her. She was here. Anyway, she wasn't so black. Hadn't she artificially lightened her skin about 4 or 5 shades until she was almost brown? Certainly it was all right. She needn't be a foolish ninny all her life. Thus reassured, she knocked on the door and felt herself trembling with this excitement and internal uncertainty as Alva let her in, took her hat and coat, and proceeded to introduce her to the people in the room. Miss Morgan, meet Mr. Tony Cruz. You've probably seen his book of poems. He's the little jazz boy, you know. Tony Cruz is Langston Hughes. Emmylou bashfully touched the extended hand of the curly-headed poet. She had not seen or read his book, but she had often noticed his name in the newspapers and magazines. He was all that she had expected him to be, except that he had pimples on his face. These didn't fit in with her mental picture. Miss Morgan, this is Cora Thurston, Zora Neale Hurston. Maybe I should have introduced you ladies first. I'm no lady, and I hope you're not either, Miss Morgan, she smiled, shook Emmylou's hand, and then turned away to continue her interrupted conversation with Tony Cruz, because Zora Neale Hurston and Langston Hughes were very close friends at a time, which I explained in my earlier videos. Miss Morgan, meet, he paused and addressed a tall, dark, yellow youth stretched out on the floor. What name you going by now? The boy looked up and smiled. Why, Paul, of course. All right then, Miss Morgan. This is Mr. Paul. He changes his name every season. Emmylou sought to observe this person more closely and was shocked to see that his shirt was open at the neck and that he was sadly in need of a haircut and shave. I believe this is the artist that is in the magazine Fire, and right now his name escapes me. Miss Morgan, meet Mr. Walter, and I believe this is Wallace Thurman. A small, slender, dark youth with an infectious smile and small features. His face was familiar. Where has she seen him before? And then it goes through, and then I'm going to skip over here to say there was a knock on the door interrupting something Tony Cruz was about to say. Now, Tony Cruz is mentioned many times because Wallace Thurman and Langston Hughes were very good friends as well. And Langston Hughes admired Wallace Thurman for his writing. And actually the next book that we're going to get into, called The Infants of the Spring, Langston Hughes considered that the best book written during the Harlem Renaissance that explains the Harlem Renaissance. However, that was surpassed by Langston Hughes' autobiography, The Big C, which is now considered the hallmark of the Harlem Renaissance. But there was a knock on the door interrupting something that Tony Cruz was about to say. Oliver went to the door. Hello, Ray. A tall, blond, fair-skinned youth entered. Emmylou gasped and was more bewildered than ever. All of this silly talk and drinking, and now here was a white man. So that white man is Carl Van Vechten, which they mention later on in the book, because Carl Van Vechten was a very thorough white friend of the black community. Many of the pictures that I show you on my pages were taken by Carl Van Vechten. Carl Van Vechten used to throw parties that everyone used to enjoy. And Carl Van Vechten wrote a book called Nigger Heaven, which black people condemned based on the novel, based on the name of the novel, Nigger Heaven, without having read the book. Those who read the book said that it was a pretty good interpretation of black life in Harlem. They didn't never want to give him full credit because he was white. So there's many things that just being white that you just can't experience as a black person experiences it and expresses it from that viewpoint. However, those who read it and those who were his close friends said that it is a very good book. I read the book and I enjoyed it. I think I got through it in one sitting. So the book is very interesting and it reads very well. And they mention that book in this story. So Wallace Thurman took that opportunity to introduce his friends, and they have a discussion about colorism. Now, in their discussion about colorism, they talk about how lighter-skinned blacks are more privileged in society than darker-skinned blacks. And they go all the way back to slavery, and they say the lighter-skinned blacks used to be the ones who got to stay in the house and be the house Negroes. The lighter-skinned blacks were the reason why they created black universities in the first place, which I can give credit to that because I went to a historically black college Morehouse College. And when you apply to a historically black college, many times you have to turn in a picture with your application. And you're like, why do we have to do that? What does my picture have to do with my qualifications? And they say it's a tradition because in historically black colleges and universities, they used to only accept lighter skinned blacks into those colleges and universities. So they talk about in this book how lighter skinned blacks are more accepted into the community because their lighter skin makes them more acceptable to white people. Now, from my slave papers that I read on the previous page, you might see that not all light-skinned blacks were allowed to work in the house. I talked to my mother and some other of my relatives since I read those papers, and he used to work out in the field. And there's a story written by Langston Hughes called Father and Son, where the image, because he's not a slave master because it's in the 1930s, but the setting of the story is as a slave plantation, and the master, Colonel Norwood, has two sons. One he sent off to college, the other one was working in the field. And by the end of the novel, both of the boys get lynched. So it's not always that the slave master's light-skinned relatives or sons or daughters get treated any better than the field hands. I believe anyone that's just willing to sell out to other slaves or the rest of the race are the ones that are allowed into the white community's use. But they talk about it in this novel. And they also mention the Blue Vein Society. And they have a lot of laughs, and they're writers, enlightened people having this discussion. And all the while, Emmylou, being color struck, believes that they're making fun of her. The whole time she believes that they're making fun of her. So as the novel proceeds and her relationship with Alva proceeds, she and Alva get into arguments and then she brings up, like, you let them talk about me. You always, you just didn't defend me when they were talking about colorism. And he was like, they're not even talking about you. He said they were just having a discussion. And then they went to a movie where she was offended because there was some blackface, and she believed that it was directed towards her. So she took offense to everything that she saw that had to do with dark skin. But at the same time, in this novel, she reflects upon herself and realizes that those prejudices that she cries about directed towards her, she inflicts onto the dark-skinned people that she encounters, as she does with her own self. She doesn't even accept her own self because she's dark. And that's reoccurs in this book many times. It's very interesting. Now, Alva cheats on Emmylou and gets another woman pregnant. So when that relationship dissolves, he's out of the picture for a while. And then Emmylou meets another fair-skinned black woman who befriends Emmylou. And this was a very interesting relationship because this woman used to always talk negative about light-skinned black people. She would talk about them just bad, like, we don't want to have anything to do with them. They think they're so good. They're not even really that good. They're, and we, just as negative. And she's focused on dark-skinned blacks because she says that she wants her family to be dark-skinned, and she wants to contribute to the brown part of the race. Now, during Emmylou's relationship with this woman, she can't stand to listen to her bash light-skinned blacks, because everything that Emmylou valued about light-skinned people, this friend of hers would bash it, and in bashing that, Emmylou didn't feel comfortable with that, because she didn't want people to mess up her image of what she valued in life with the right sort of people. So Emmylou meets this light-skinned black man. I can't remember his name, but they describe him as a very, very ugly, not well put together, fair-skinned black man. But Emmylou goes out with him purely based on the fact that he was fair-skinned. There was nothing admirable about this guy. He wasn't very intelligent. He didn't have a lot of conversation. He wasn't real slick. He wasn't a player like Alva. But she was going out with him simply for the fact that he was fair-skinned. But while she was out with him, she still was in love with Alva. And then throughout the novel, Alva reconnects with Emmylou. Okay, and the light-skinned girl that was talking to Emmylou in the negative aspect of light-skinned people, where she was putting down light-skinned people and saying that it's better to have dark-skinned boyfriends and dark-skinned husbands. When Emmylou left her relationship with that light-skinned man that she had to pursue Alva, once Emmylou realized that she no longer wanted to be with Alva, she got back in contact with that light-skinned man to find out that that light-skinned man and Emmylou's light-skinned friend were going to get married. So what this demonstrates is the strength and the power of the racist American discourse and the power of miseducation. And that's what Wallace Thurman likes to write about in his books. He likes to demonstrate that dynamic in his books, because Emmylou, being dark-skinned, realized that she was being discriminated against as a dark-skinned woman, but she realized that she also discriminated against black people. But she couldn't help it, because that's how she was educated, that's how she was brought up, and that's in American discourse. And this light-skinned friend of hers, who was adamantly against socializing, putting light-skinned people on a pedestal, falling in love with light-skinned people, ended up marrying a light-skinned man. Because you can be intellectually conscious. You can know what the deal is. However, that still does not mean that who you are as a person and your likes and dislikes are not controlled by American discourse. So what conscious people do, and what intellectual people who are intellectually conscious, before they can start preaching what black people should do, can do, and must do, they themselves must reconstruct their likes and dislikes. And it doesn't happen overnight. Just as you know that you've been educated since day one to have certain likes and dislikes, have certain philosophies, and believing what is right and what is wrong took years to form you as a person. It may take years to reverse all that you have learned once you do become conscious. And that's interesting in this book, The Blacker the Berry. And it's also a discussion that comes up in the other book we're going to look at, the next book that we're going to look at, Infants of the Spring by Wallace Thurman. And he actually makes this discussion outright when he's talking about how the black community, how the black male views the white female back in the 1930s. And I still believe that much of that philosophy that we're going to discuss when we look at that book still holds true today. Now, what was going on with Alva brings in another aspect of the black community that needs to be addressed. Alva had a baby with another woman. A woman had his baby, so he left Emmylou to be with this woman. When the woman had the baby came out mentally ill and deformed. Now, mental illness in the black community is taboo. People are starting to discuss it more now, but it's not accepted. Like, black people don't like to accept mental illness in the community. It goes untreated, and those who are mentally ill are not treated very well. And I noticed that in this novel, there was nothing positive mentioned about this deformed and mentally ill child that Alva and the woman had. Her name was Geraldine. Now, Alva's mother criticized the child and said the reason why it's deformed is because it's an illegitimate child. You didn't follow your Christian lifestyle, so God's punishing you with this child. And then there was a competition between Alva and Geraldine. They didn't like each other because of this child. They were contemplating leaving each other, and the competition became who's going to leave first. And Geraldine came to the conclusion that I was going to leave her, so she left him to care for the child because she said she didn't want to be stuck with this child, so she left, and then Alva was stuck with the child. Alva reconnected with Emmylou. Emmylou was still head over heels for Alva. And there's another discussion because he was a bad boy and she just admired his qualities over that other light-skinned guy who she met, who, even though he had no special qualities about him, he was still part of the right society. He wasn't a bad boy. But she reconnects with Alva. He uses her to become a nanny to this child. Emmylou doesn't like the child. Through this relationship and her living with Alva and trying to build a family, Alva starts to go back to his player ways. He started having parties and neglecting Emmylou, neglecting the child. And then Emmylou comes home one day from work, and Alva's there partying. When she opens the door, she notices a lady boy sitting on Alva's lap, which is another issue in the black community that Wallace Thurman touches on in this book, which is the LGBTQ community. Now, this is in 1929 when he is mentioning this. 1929. People didn't talk about those things back then. But this is towards the end of the novel where Emmylou doesn't even address this lady boy. But Alva doesn't want him to leave. All of Alva's friends who are also there at this party, they all leave, but he demands that this lady boy stay there. And at this point of the novel is where Emmylou decides that she don't want Alva. She don't want to regard light-skinned people, dark-skinned people. She realizes that any way that she's going to make it, she's going to have to depend on herself, work with what she has. So she kind of comes to a realization that she has to focus on herself, and she just abandons that baby who she was caring for without a second thought. And she abandons Alva, and Alva's left with the lady boy, and the child, and then at the end of the novel ends with her packing her things and getting ready to go out in life. So as you see, The Blacker the Berry, a novel of Negro life, a lot of discussions going on in this book. I recommend that you get the book. I have the book. I don't have this version. I got this from the library. I couldn't find my version. My version looks like this. So get this book so you can see the history of blacks moving from the South to the West to the East. Discussions of mental illness in the black community, the LGBTQ community in the black community, colorism in the black community, and also read this book because it does have a depiction of jazz life and cabaret life, which Wallace Thurman runs through in a stream of consciousness, which also appears in many of the books during the Harlem Renaissance. And I may, in a later page, just read through that thought of consciousness. It may not be me reading. I may have one of my friends go ahead and read that. But it's a thought of consciousness, which I didn't discuss because it's just a description of what was going on at the cabarets when they're dancing and smoking and having a good time, which is very important to the writers of this period because they really wanted to show, what went on during this period where everyone thought everybody was nice and happy and dancing. So they like to show the negative life and the hardships in the black community, but they also wanted to show the high life and the parties and what was going on, and it's very, very sexual, the descriptions of the dances and everything that were going on, and not very, they were sexual but not very tantalizing. So, but I may just read that section on another page. So get the book, The Blacker the Berry, a novel of Negro life. There are many things that you may relate to, and then many things that you'll see that are antiquated, but discussions that were had during then, and we still haven't come to a conclusion, so we need to hurry up and come to a conclusion with these discussions because we don't need to be discussing them for another 100 years before we decide to advance. This is Black Literature, Black History. Jason Williams. Have a nice evening.